It says your stream is live. All right. So those who are on, well, not on the stream just yet, but watching the recording, welcome. Glad to have you. We are back from our 1 week hiatus. How many of you were at the district event last week? It was the two of you ladies. Okay. It was a good meeting, I thought. Although I guess I'd be more interested in what the two of you thought, since quite frankly, that meeting was not for me. I've heard everything that was said at that meeting about 87 times.
We need more money, we need more pastors, and we need more people.
And
here's the resources.
No district office has ever told that to anyone before. This is a brand new problem. That the pastor shortage is something that's a bit concerning. And although we really shouldn't say pastor shortage, we should say church worker shortage, because I mean, pastors are kind of, the pastor shortage is in the limelight, if you will. But teachers, DCEs, deacons and deaconesses, organists are all just, if things keep going the way they are going, we're in bad shape. But this is the Lord's church. The Lord is not dead. His church will not die either. And so we trust in that. Even if the LCMS is not here for eternity, the Lord's church will continue on. So we'll trust in that. But if you happen to know someone that you think might be a good pastor, teacher, deaconess, church worker, organist of any stripe, tell them, encourage them, because they are needed. I've already been pestering a few people around here. Well, he's one of them, yeah. But not the only one, not the only. I have 3 young men on my radar for the pastoral office.
Matthew, and...
You got 2 of them. There's a third one. Yeah, there's a third one. I'm not going to tell you.
I like those two.
I'm not sure if he knows he's on my radar yet. But I'll just let you all chew on that. That'll be a fun thing for you to do when you're not listening to the philosophy talk we're going to have today. So, over the last 2 weeks we covered, or not last 2 weeks, last 2 sessions of the class, we have covered the first 200 years of Lutheran history. We saw in the 1st century how Lutheranism kind of went from the universities and spread out, kind of figured out what Lutheranism is. We had the confessional era of the church, where all those documents were being written, the various different controversies that came out of kind of Lutherans figuring out what does it actually mean to be a Lutheran? What do we believe? Let's formalize, systematize all of this. Then in the 17th century, we saw the 30 Years' War, the absolute devastation that it caused, and most specifically for our narrative, we saw how the 30 Years' War, along with other things as well, drove the Lutherans to kind of become an insular group. What you believed, how you believed, and the way you believed became the important things. Were you a Lutheran or were you not? Who were the real Lutherans? Kind of who could you trust? There's a little bit of paranoia going on in this sort of thing. But doctrinal subscription, confessional subscription became really the litmus test for who is a Lutheran and who is not. Right? If you don't confess the Book of Concord, you're not a Lutheran. You might call yourself a Lutheran for political reasons, but you're just not a Lutheran. Right? And we can kind of see how all of this, even now, impacts the culture of who we, as the LCMS, is as Lutherans. Something Wright and I were talking about before the class got started that I didn't really talk about in either of the last 2 classes, although next class we're going to look at it in more detail. Lutherans are not staying in Europe, right? Now, the Lutheran hubs are Germany, Scandinavia, these kinds of areas. But people are going to the New World, right? Remember, 1517 is when Luther nailed the 95 Theses, so just a couple decades after the Americas were discovered, right? At least discovered by Europeans. I happen to recall there were a lot of people already living there. And if a German moved to the Americas and he was a Lutheran or she was a Lutheran, well then guess what moved into the Americas with them? It was their faith. Some of the early settlers of Georgia, for some of our history, are Lutherans. Some Lutheran groups that were moving over there. In fact, and we can make this as our stamp of honor, the first orphanage in the state of Georgia was founded by Lutherans that came over here. I was also talking to I don't remember when exactly it was, but Charles Wesley, the guy who kind of did the Methodist Church, when he came over on a boat, he was with a bunch of Lutherans. And there was this giant storm, everyone almost died, and Wesley made great note that everyone on the boat was panicking and freaking out, except for these weird Germans who were just over in a corner praying to themselves. There were some German Lutherans. And in his memoirs, he talks about them. This is kind of a pivotal moment in his life, seeing the faith of the Lutherans. Now, he didn't become a Lutheran, but you can't fault everyone for that. So, throughout the entirety of the history of Lutheranism is moving into not only the New World, but globalism is just beginning to start. Right, we're starting to get out of the age of exploration, and people are, right, because of industry and economy and all of that, going around, Europeans at least, are going around the world. And we'll see a little bit of that at the end of today's class of Lutheran, with Lutheran missions, Lutheran missionaries that are leaving Europe and actively going as missionaries to some of these other areas of the world. We'll get to that. But next week is where I've chosen to really hit the Lutherans coming to America, not because the Saxon immigrants were the first Lutherans in America, because they were not by a long shot, but because the LCMS comes from the Saxon immigrants that came over in the 19th century. So that's where they get put in. But there are, even by today's class, there are already large German populations, primarily up in the Minnesota region. And over in New York, there was another, or the general New York area, there's another fairly large Lutheran population there as well. In the 19th century, it's going to go to Missouri, Ohio, and some other states. But that's for next week. So today, in our journey through the 18th century, Lutheranism, or well, really all of Europe, but for our purposes, Lutherans are going to start to encounter and run into something called the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. And in that, paired with a bunch of other stuff that is kind of left over from the last century, we're going to see that there's a lot of stuff going on. And a lot of heads are about to run into each other, for better or for worse. Often it's for worse, although we're not talking wars, guns, and pikes, and all of that kind of stuff, right? The era, at least as far as this class is concerned, of physical war conflict is over. It doesn't mean that Lutherans are involved in things, but it's no longer relevant to our story. But intellectual conflicts are arising. And so at the outset of the 18th century, there existed 3 intellectual factions in Lutheran Germany and Scandinavia. Now, these are not all of the intellectual factions. These are the ones that exist within what we are calling Lutheranism, right? So within the Lutheran Church at large, there are kind of 3 major parties. And of course, right, what was my disclaimer at the beginning of the class? Everything is way more complicated than I'm going to make it, right? Just because I don't have time to get into the details. Quite frankly, nor do either of us want that. I read a book that kind of gets into some of those nooks and crannies, and it can be exhausting. I was telling a few of you last week, it's like 30 pages of a very dense book that I just completely skipped over because it was nothing but lists of names and books. It wasn't even what the books are about. It was exhausting. It was horrible to read. There are plenty of people who are very interested in that kind of stuff. I am not one of them. and so you don't get it. Is basically how it goes. So within Lutheran Germany and Scandinavia, we have three intellectual parties that are kind of at play. The first is what we're going to call the Orthodox Party. The second is the Pietist Party. And then the third is just rationalism. Rationalism, we're going to talk about in detail here. Rationalism is kind of an exterior. It does not come from Lutheranism, although there were a lot of Lutherans involved. A lot of Lutherans became philosophers that drove rationalism in that era. But rationalism is so pervasive in Europe that it includes everything. Everyone in Europe in the 18th century is dealing with rationalism. And that's not a bad thing. There are some things that are bad that we don't like about rationalism, but there are some things that are very, very, very good that come out of rationalism. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. We're going to get into all of that here in a minute. Questions so far about who our major players are for this section. So we have the Orthodox Party. This is the one we closed the previous class talking about. These are I need to find out who is with me and who's against me, who believes what I believe, and that is, who is a Lutheran, who is not. That's done through confessional subscription and doctrine, right? The Pietist Party, which starts in the 17th century. I'm going to go over them in detail in a minute here. And then there's this rationalism, which we're going to cover in tremendous detail in just a second. So we kind of all on the same page on who we're going to be talking about today. So rationalism, where does it come from? Rationalism is an outcrop of the Enlightenment, right? This is a philosophical movement with incredibly far and deep-reaching impacts, which, quite frankly, is how philosophy always is. It's a bit of a strange paradigm, right? On the one hand, probably most of what I'm going to talk about today, you might have heard of some of these names. Are any of you, I don't actually know this, do any of you really like philosophy and read philosophy? All right, so Katie, you and I are going to have a good time today. I love philosophy. In fact, I almost majored in philosophy. I was about that close to doing it.
Glad you didn't.
Well, I was still going to be a pastor, but... So on the one hand, philosophy is kind of erudite and stoic and kind of up in those academic cloisters. But in other ways, the way that you think and view the world around you is a result of the philosophy of the world around us. And that is very much a part of the Enlightenment. And again, this is for better and for worse, and there are conflicting philosophies and all of that sort of stuff. So, before we go into rationalism and the Enlightenment, what we need to do is I'm going to give you three major eras of philosophy. And they should be, they're on your note here, or on your worksheet. You'll notice one of them has a lot more space than the other two. That's the one we're going to be talking about. So the three categories, the three eras of philosophy are going to be pre-modernism, modernism, and postmodernism. You've probably heard, especially that last phrase before. We live in a postmodern world. This is how philosophy is impacting you, whether you know it or not. All of this is way more complicated, but for our purposes and for a simple understanding here, these eras are defined by what Pontius Pilate's famous question, right? Quid est veritas? What is truth? Right? Very philosophical question. And so it's a question of what is truth and where do you get it from? What is its source? Right? And these three eras are distinguished by how those two questions are answered by most philosophers. And again, people are different, right? We live in a milieu. So pre-modern philosophy says that objective truth does exist. There is a belief in objective truth. However, objective truth is unattainable by the individual and therefore must be provided by the divine or divinity. an easy example is this is the Christian worldview, quite frankly, right? We view God as the arbiter of objective truth, and the only way we know that objective truth is for him to tell us, in our case, through the pages of Holy Scripture. This is how most pre-modern philosophies work, but not all of them. Not all pre-modern philosophies require religion in this sort of sense. The one that really comes to mind here is Plato. So Plato and his Platonic philosophy requires divinity. He calls it the unmoved mover, but there's no faith aspect. And you can grasp objective truth through the emanations of the Platonic forms, which, let me tell you, is fascinating stuff. That sentence I just said is why we talk about communion the way we talk about communion, but it's not what we're talking about here today. And so if you have no idea what emanations of the Platonic forms in the mind of the unmoved mover means, don't worry about it. It is completely irrelevant to our conversation. The point is, you don't have to have a God handing down divine revelation in the pre-modern system. It happens a lot, but not exclusively. The modern era, so we have pre-modernism, objective truth exists. You cannot get to it unless God gives it to you in one form or another. Modernism says that objective truth exists and it is obtainable by means of human reason alone. That last part, the alone, is the conclusion of modernism. Early on, and we're going to talk a lot about it, early on, that alone part doesn't exist yet. By the time modernism has run its course, human reason is the only arbiter of objective truth. Finally, in postmodern philosophy, let's see, how do I write it down here? There is no objective truth. Or, if there is objective truth, it doesn't matter, because you cannot get to it. The only way that any of us arrive at anything approximating truth is by making that truth for ourselves. Again, this is not what we're talking about today. I'm just giving you the groundwork here for potentially future classes. Now, a little bit of a soapbox here. Postmodernism has been given a scarlet letter by many religious institutions. I think it is unwarranted. Personally, postmodernism does a lot of good things philosophically. It is very helpful in a lot of ways. It undoes a lot of the real problems that modernism arrives at, and it is more friendly to a religious atmosphere, in my opinion. It is more friendly to God than modernism is, which we'll get into in a minute, because that might be surprising to many people. Like I said, postmodernism has been a four-letter word on and off. I don't think it deserves that title. There's some bad stuff with postmodernism too. None of these are perfect, right? Even pre-modernism has its problems, right? Who's your God? How are you attaining it? That doesn't get you to Christianity or anything like that. But postmodernism isn't just evil outright. So, modernism. This modern Enlightenment era, rationalism is kind of the name that's also given to this philosophy. Objective truth is obtainable by means of human reason alone. This all starts, so we see the transition from pre-modern into modern with a guy by the name, a French guy, by the name of René Descartes. If you know anything about René Descartes, it's his very famous phrase, which is what kicks off the Enlightenment: cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Which, of course, is great, right? Because he thought that up while in like 115-degree sauna in France. Interesting guy. By the way, I really like Descartes. I've read a lot of his stuff, which is not a misery I would wish on many people. It is very dense and hard to get through. But Anyway, his what is it? His big book, Discourse on the Method of Rightly Conducting One's Reason and Seeking Truth in the Sciences. That's the title of the book that Cogito Ergo Sum comes out of. You can imagine what the inside of that book is like. But it's got there's some good stuff in there, and he provides his own proof for God in that. It's okay. It's not the best proof for God that's out there, but it's a nice one, and it works off of that what's known as the uncertainty principle, which is what Descartes was doing. So basically, Descartes, while in a sauna, was trying to prove in his mind that stuff existed, which sounds very strange, but this is what philosophers do, right? His question is, how do I know that existence exists, right? Which again seems like a really ridiculous question to us, oftentimes, but it's just what philosophers do. And what Descartes basically did is he said, I'm going to doubt everything that I cannot fundamentally prove. And what he arrives at is basically saying, I cannot be certain that Jeff exists. Jeff could be a figment of my imagination. This table could be a figment of my imagination, right? This entire universe, my body, could be a figment of my imagination. But there is something that is doing the imagining. There is something that is thinking. That has to exist. Because I am thinking, right? I am doubting. Because I am doubting, I exist. I think, therefore I am. And from there, Descartes then reconstructs the entire universe. It takes him a lot of pages to do so. And also, that's how he does his proof. His proof for God is basically, I cannot get out of my head that a higher being than me exists, therefore God exists. It's a little bit more refined than that, not a lot. But he puts it in his discourse on the method, which is what most people call that. This, by the way, is called rational skepticism. And what Descartes has done, he didn't realize it at the time, but what Descartes has done is he has made human reason the arbiter of all existence. Probably realized that, but what he doesn't realize certainly, because he couldn't have foreseen the future, is that all other things, all other measures of truth will die because of this. And I chose those words carefully for a reason. We'll get to that. From this rational skepticism, I think, therefore I am, reason can establish truth. Rationalism extends into all areas of life and creates the single best thing to come out of the Enlightenment and rationalism. And I mean this very seriously, the scientific method. The scientific method is Descartes' rational skepticism methodized, systematized to produce results and greater knowledge and answers to questions. The reason most of us are not dead right now is because of the scientific method, right? I don't know about all of you. Have you ever taken an antibiotic?
Yeah.
So I have. There's always a chance that every time you had to take an antibiotic, before antibiotics existed, you would have been dead. It just would have killed you, right? I wouldn't have made it. I was incredibly sick at 2 months at viral meningitis. If it had not been for the scientific method, no Pastor Berling's barely even, I mean, there wouldn't have been a toddler, Jacob, right? So, scientific method, very good. And this is where it comes from. The origins of the scientific method are René Descartes' uncertainty principle. This whole thing gets developed by a number of philosophies over a number of centuries, right? And I'm just giving you a quick rundown of this whole thing. Some of these philosophers that you may have heard of, one, we got to throw in the first Lutheran here, Kierkegaard, right, who has an awesome book about fear and trembling, where he looks through the binding of Isaac and kind of deals with all sorts of existential stuff there. Kierkegaard, who kind of pioneers rational religion, not always a good thing. Rousseau, who does the social contract. If you you have any good feelings towards our government, it's because of Rousseau and the social contract, and a few other guys like Locke, who has his Tabula Rasa, right? And he also does some other political philosophy stuff. Probably the next guy that's particularly relevant, although we're not going to get into a lot with him, is Spinoza. Spinoza is probably not the first, but one of the first. One of these places that we can point to that where rationalism divorces itself from religion. Spinoza is rational agnosticism. That's what he pioneers. He also pioneers deism, which we're going to come back to that. That's what almost all of our founding fathers were. They were not Christians, they were deists. They were deists with Christian flavor. Right? So the flavor of Jell-O that they were was Christian. The flavor of deists that they were was Christian. But not all of them. There were real, true, solid Christian founding fathers. There were. But people like Thomas Jefferson, he's far on the other end, right? He has his edition of the Bible where he just takes a knife and he says, well, all this is nonsense. Here's the real Bible, right? That's coming out of this rational agnosticism and deism, which we'll talk more about that particular thing a little bit later when we see all these different ideas coming to a head with one another. Rationalism culminates with a philosopher named Immanuel Kant. He's a 19th century philosopher. Kant is fantastically complicated and very difficult. I've had to read some of his books and they're not fun. But basically what Kant does, at least for our purposes, is he says that human reason is the final word on all things. It is the final word on truth. Even though one of his books is the critique of pure reason, but we don't have to worry about that. Where he kind of Kant does foresee the next philosopher that we're going to talk about, and he recognizes that his system has flaws, but he can't figure them out. The next guy we're going to talk about does. But Kant makes human reason the final word on all things. The big kind of, you probably have not heard of it, it's a little niche. Kant has what's called the categorical imperative, which is really fascinating, and it's a fun thing to do, to play around with his categorical imperative. But that's not what we're talking about today. Basically, what the categorical imperative does is it removes all influences from ethics apart from reason. So the only arbiter of truth, the only arbiter of ethics is human reason. And with kind of these two things, Immanuel Kant has made man the measure of all things, right? Even though that's an old Greek philosopher, classical Greek philosopher who said man is the measure of all things. But essentially, humans are the arbiters of truth, and humans are the arbiters of good. The human reason specifically is the arbiter of all things. Questions here before we hit our last philosopher, who's very relevant here, but might cause more questions. Any of you know who this next guy is going to be? Oh, you've been making faces at me. I'm like, oh, Jeff knows where I'm going with this.
No.
So, depending on who you talk to, Immanuel Kant is the last of the modernistic philosophers. I have been convinced by a number of very intelligent people that he's not, that we have one more that follows Immanuel Kant. It is a name that you know. It is Friedrich Nietzsche, who started out as a Lutheran. But how Lutheran Nietzsche was at any point in his life is a little... he had that name. He was baptized as a Lutheran. That might be about it. What have you heard about Nietzsche? This is just me curious now.
The name sounds familiar. He was a slut.
Well...
he was emo, he made himself depressed, and he's like, nothing matters.
He does get into a little bit of nothing. Yeah, he is he pioneers proto-nihilism. Just lay out some more guys before we get into true nihilism. Nihilism is nothing matters. There is nothing. Nothing.
We believe in nothing about you.
Yeah. Right, nihilism was very popular in like the 70s. It was cool to be a nihilist, right?
How did they differ from anarchists?
Anarchist is a political idea. And this is going to sound really weird, anarchism is actually a utopian philosophy.
They believe in no universal truths. How could that be?
Well, they believe that man is fundamentally capable of governing himself. And therefore, the things that cause problems in the world are governments. And overseeing entities, right? Well, I mean, there's something to that, right? Who's starting massive world wars? Well, it's not just Joe Schmo over here, right? It's nations and these sorts of things. And so the anarchists say the solution, because all humans are capable of governing themselves, is to get rid of all governing authorities. Hence why anarchism is actually a utopian philosophy. Falls under that category because
I see it now.
they kind of think everything would be sunshine and rainbows if we just got rid of all the governments. Which, ask the Russian Revolution how, because they had a very large anarchist party that almost won the Russian Revolution. But instead, the commies won, right? Communists were red, the anarchists were black, and then the imperialists were white. So it was the red, the black, and the white fighting each other. Anyway, I just finished a couple months ago a 150 or so hour podcast on the Russian Revolution. Fascinating, really well done. Really gets into the nitty gritty with all of this. I was shocked. It took this guy like 125 hours to kill off the Romanovs, right? I mean, I've seen Anastasia. That's like the first thing that happens, isn't it? Apparently not. It's also nothing like the movie. Shocking. That's not what we're talking about. No. So, Nietzsche. Nietzsche recognizes the problems with Kant's pure reason and kind of drives him to his inevitable conclusion, which is why I put him in the camp of a modernist philosopher, although what he does is he closes the door on modernism and opens the postmodern. So he's a transitional philosopher. You can say he's the last modernist and the first postmodern philosopher. Basically, this is how Nietzsche's thought process goes. If man is the measure of all things, and human reason is at the center of man, at the center of all things, as the arbiter of truth as well as good, then, and if you have heard of Nietzsche, this is probably why, then God is dead and we have killed him, right? That's a Nietzsche quote. It's out of his book, The Gay Science, although he also brings it back in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. What's your reaction to God is dead? Because I think most people have a massive misunderstanding about this, which is probably not encouraging you to answer that question.
Wasn't it like reducing? They wanted to, in order to fill themselves on a level playing field, they tried to reduce religion to just another philosophy.
I think that's how most people
and then
tend to
saying
think.
Like, oh, that's you're over, you're canceled. It's dead.
Yeah, that's how most people kind of view this. This is not what Nietzsche is saying.
Okay.
In fact, and I probably should have put it in here, go read the full quote, because it is, the statement that God is dead is not a triumph, like a victory speech. It's a lament, right? Nietzsche says, it's God is dead and we have killed him. We have become the murderer of all murderers. What shall we do to wipe the stain of all stains off of ourselves, right?
So he was lamenting like the overthinking process that he had himself.
So what he's lamenting and what he's recognizing, he's not inventing it.
Away Christianity.
He says this is what Europe has already done. Europe acts, thinks as if God does not exist. And therefore, according to Nietzsche, it doesn't actually matter if God exists or not, because we don't act like he does. And so, and that's, boo-hoo atheism, right? Which is true. What Nietzsche's also recognizing is if God is dead, if we have killed him and we have put ourselves in his place, which that's also in the quote, I think he says, we must make ourselves gods to even believe we might be worthy of this act we have committed or something. What Nietzsche is recognizing is if we make ourselves to be gods through this act of human reason, then bad things will happen and there's no way of stopping it. Which he was super right about. Right, we're driving towards some things here, right? So this is an absolute lament. Nietzsche is very concerned about this, and he has no way of fixing this problem. That's why he says God is dead, not God. We kicked God out. He says there's no way to come back from. Right, we've opened Pandora's box. We cannot come back from this. We're doomed. This is very much a humanity is done. We're toast because we ruined ourselves, basically. So God does not matter because humanity, particularly the strong, is the arbiter of all things. This particularly the strong. If you know God is dead, and you know one more thing about Nietzsche, it's probably, by the way, I don't actually know how to say his name, so that's why. Nietzsche. No, I don't know how to say that one either. This is the Ubermensch, the Superman, right? How many of you, it's actually, Nietzsche's idea here has come back recently, especially with COVID. COVID brought one of these Superman thoughts back. How many of you have heard the term sheeple? Right? I'm not with the sheeple. They follow the masses. I'm my own person. That's Nietzsche. That is his thought. So what Nietzsche says is it is not actually humanity, the individual, that becomes the true arbiter of truth. Because most people are too weak to admit that God is dead and take up the mantle for themselves, to fill that place on their own. He says that takes a certain kind of person, the person that he calls the Ubermensch, or the Superman. That the Superman, the Ubermensch, will go into this category, make himself God, the arbiter of truth, and impose his will on others. This is the will to power, right? You may have heard that phrase as well. Everyone who was posting on Facebook about how they're not sheeple likes to think that they are the category of the Ubermensch. They are not. I can say that just point blank, carte blanche. I am not in the category of the Ubermensch. None of you are in the category of the Ubermensch. There have been extremely few of these people that fit Nietzsche's description in all of human history. And in fact, the one that really does fit this mold, that's top of mind and very recognizable, is Adolf Hitler. Jesus does fit this category as well, but he's also God, so it's a little bit different. No, and Hitler's idea was, I want a country of Ubermensch. He was reading Nietzsche. This is where Hitler's ideas, part of where his ideas come from, was out of this sort of idea. He says, I want a country of Ubermensch. Because that would be the superior race that would make the Third Reich, the 1,000-year empire, all that kind of stuff. Well, you can't have a country of Ubermensch. It is not possible. Unfortunately, Hitler was in that role, right? He was an individual that possessed the will to power, and he did extraordinary evil with that. Right? I mean, he brought his entire country, right, the whole Nazis, all of them. You will know all of the history there, right? He used his will to power to impose his truth upon others who followed him like sheep. Nietzsche doesn't say sheeple, but he does say that we are the sheep following the Ubermensch. And he, right, committed genocide with it. That's what he chose to do with his will to power, right? So, you don't want to be an Ubermensch because almost always bad stuff happens, and which Nietzsche recognizes because, right? Oh, Spider-Man, right? With great power comes great responsibility, right? Well, with great power also comes the ability to abuse that power, right? And so when you have someone who's able to impose their will upon others and become a true Ubermensch, almost always they use it to suit their own agenda, and they crush people with it. This is why most people don't like Ayn Rand, who's another one of these philosophers who kind of deals with this, because Ayn Rand says it's a good thing. Those that possess the will to power should crush the weak beneath them. And, like, how many of you have ever given money or food to someone who's homeless? Ayn Rand would say that is immoral. Why? They're weak. Let them die. That's Ayn Rand. It's intense.
Like a brutal Darwinism.
Yeah, I mean, yes. It kind of comes out as, she does a lot with social Darwinism. Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. If you've ever seen a book that's about that thick, it's Ayn Rand. Her books are enormous. But no, I mean, so Nietzsche and Rand, for that matter, although Rand's kind of a postmodern philosopher, they both recognize that this is a very bad, well, Ayn Rand calls it good, but it's a very bad thing. That's why Nietzsche's lamenting this. This is the outcome of the Enlightenment. When you push rationalism to its inevitable conclusion, you get World War II. You World War I as well, right? Like, a package deal, right? World War I is the first half. The Great Depression is the halftime show, and then World War II is the second half, right? This is an awful start to the century, right? Enlightenment inevitably leads to rationalism, inevitably leads to World War II. That is just what happens when man becomes the measure of all things. And then those who are powerful recognize it and use it to their own ends. It's what bore itself out in history. By the way, this is not all we're going to talk about World War II. World War II definitely comes up. Probably not in the way you're thinking, though. In our last class, we'll touch briefly on World War II again. But good things come out of rationalism. Like I said, I would not be here without rationalism. The Enlightenment is not wholesale evil. There are good things, scientific method, that come out of Enlightenment. But some really bad stuff comes out of it, too. Which, by the way, this is kind of why postmodernism has a solution to the World War II problem, the will to power. Not necessarily a great one, but it's also not what we're talking about. All right, that was a lot, and it was a lot of philosophy.
So how does that, other than just, being history, how does that tie into the history of Lutheran?
So, this is not the next thing we're going to talk about, but it's coming up. This is the worldview that the Lutherans are dealing with. And there are Lutherans who are starting to think this way, particularly with the rational deism, agnosticism, those sorts of things. And actually, the one that's going to come up here, and then it's going to come up again very seriously in our last class, is one of these schools that come out of rationalism is known as historical criticism. Have you ever heard that phrase before?
Historical criticism?
Yes, historical criticism. So, basically, how this interacts with Lutheranism, we're going to kind of get to the interactions here in a little bit, is you have a lot of agnostic, let's just call it agnostic thought, that's about to come just battering ram into Lutheran orthodoxy and Lutheran pietism, which we're going to cover in a minute here. And then how they are interacting and kind of the outcomes of that are why this is included. Also, it was longer than it probably had to be because I like philosophy, so I'm going to give you the full picture. But, as I said, rationalism and particularly historical criticism is going to be a major driver of the events of the 20th century that we're going to cover. Basically, if it were not for historical criticism, the ELCA would not exist. And this is where it comes from. So I'm laying some foundational work for something that's going to happen in 200 years, basically. So historical criticism comes out of rationalism. So during the influx of rationalism in the Enlightenment, traditional views of the Bible began to be questioned. These are things like, well, the biggest question of this day was authorship. Who wrote it? who actually wrote the Bible? And that's how the question was being asked, right? Up until historical criticism, who wrote Isaiah? Isaiah. No one asked a question about it, right? Who wrote John? John. Now, all of a sudden, with historical criticism, you have people saying, well, Ezra and Nehemiah could not have been written when they were. They had to have been written around the 100s BC, right? Paul certainly didn't write Ephesians. Are you crazy? Right? And so who wrote these books of the Bible starts being questioned. That's one of the first areas, but it also questions the transmission of the text. How did we get what we got? Right? And really what is at stake here is inerrancy and inspiration. So basically, historical criticism wholesale says the Bible is not inspired by God, because that's ridiculous, according to rational thought. It is unreasonable that God would inspire a book to be written, the Bible to be written. And so they just cut that out. They pull the inspiration out. And with that goes inerrancy. So the assumption with historical criticism is this is a human book, and it contains within it human errors. And here are all the different ways we can prove that, right? By the way, there's probably a lot of what I said sounds familiar, and you're thinking, oh wait, we're not in the 20th century yet, or the 21st century. These ideas, historical criticism is not as popular as it used to be, and some of the ideas that it came up with, the one that's really started to be debunked or not thought seriously about is this idea that the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, were written by 5 different authors and spliced together. That used to be popular. People don't really think that as much anymore, but that comes out of historical criticism, right? So someone sees in Genesis that God's referred to as Yahweh, but he's also referred to as Elohim. It was like, well, obviously, different authors. And so you have the Yahwist author, and then you have the Elohimist author, and then you have the priestly author, so anything about a sacrifice, or anything that has to do with the temple. That was the priestly class in the intertestamental period. They must have written that part and put it in there. And then you have the Deuteronomists. Getting my head a little bit and that is, some guy wrote a speech, and that's the last book. Almost all of the Deuteronomist author is the book of Deuteronomy, which is why it has that name. And this is something that was really popular for a while, especially in the 1960s. People tend not to think that anymore. There's also, you might hear of Matthew using a different source. And that's the manuscript that's known as Q. Yeah. Now, have we ever found Q? No. Have we ever found a scrap of Q? No. But it had to have existed for all these weirdo reasons, right? Of course, we have no evidence for it other than people reading things into the writing. As I said, we're going to... historical textual criticism would be the foundation of much controversy in the Lutheran Church in the centuries to come. This is where it's coming from. But basically, and Thomas Jefferson, as I mentioned earlier, he says, well, none of this is original. Let's cut it all out. Get rid of it. There is something known as text criticism, which sounds a lot like historical textual criticism, but it is doing a similar thing but from a very different direction. Text criticism is a field of study you have to be far smarter than me to do. And that is the people who look at all the different scraps that we have, all the little fragments, and piece together what the original was. It's a lot of knowing the languages very, very well, and looking into things. Textual criticism is a good thing because it gets to the original text and removes errors that had come in through transmission that we can identify and remove. For what it's worth, if you're concerned about this, you can talk to me another time, but there are almost no errors in the Bible. There are a few sections that we're not sure about, One of them, the big one, is the ending of Mark. Right? You ever notice in Mark 16, there's a big line that says some of the earliest manuscript evidence does not contain that kind of stuff. Where we're like, well, we're not quite sure, but most of what text criticism does is very minor. But you just take it as I'm a very vague authority on this. You can trust the Bible you have that it is what the authors wrote, to like a 99.99% error, or whichever one is the no error sign, right? We can be very confident because of text criticism. Historical text criticism, very bad. Text criticism, good. Right? Does that make sense? All right. So now, you missed the whole philosophy conversation.
I'll have to catch it on.
Yeah, there you go. All right. So Pietism. So we're spending a lot of time, and I understand that, on who these people are, who these thoughts are. We'll get, once we understand them butting heads with each other will make a lot of sense. Pietism. This is a movement that originated in 1670. We have an actual date for it, in Frankfurt. Yes, I understand that the 16th century, or the 1670s, is the 17th, not the 18th century. But Pietism has most of its influence in the 18th century. It started in 1670 in Frankfurt with 6 individuals led by senior minister Philip Jacob Spener. And I'm going to make this mistake and call him Spencer, because it's one letter different. His name is Spener. It is not Spencer, it's Spener. But when I call him Spencer later, you'll know that it's a slip of the tongue. It began as a book and Bible study, which was intended to deepen spiritual living. It's a lot like a small group, honestly, or a family group in our context, is how this thing got going. It sought to address the lack of piety in the church, hence the name Pietism. It saw a collapse of church and society as a direct result of the apathy and denigration caused by the 30 Years' War. Right? Everyone in Germany was just so tired, everyone was dying, and no one cared about anything anymore. Right? Germany was just very depressed. And Spener and this small group said, well, no, that's not good. We need to encourage pious living. So in 7 years, so by 1677, the group had grown to about 100 individuals, men and women, and had spawned other groups in other cities. Now, before we get too excited about how inclusive the Pietism movement is, yes, there were women, but they had to sit in the other room and listen. They could not say anything. So it would be as if, right, the men met in the sanctuary, we opened those 2 doors, and while the men talked, the lady folk could sit here and listen. So, I mean, not that progressive in gender equality and that kind of stuff. But there were both men and women involved in this thing. Critics of the movement rose even in the 1600s. Because the group began to separate themselves from the Orthodox movement, which was the major movement of the latter 17th century. Basically, the idea was the Orthodox they got their nose in a book, they're not doing anything, all they do is read and write and sit in their offices all day. We want to do something with our life. We want to live out the Christian life rather than just reading about it in a book.
So were the Puritans influenced by Pietism?
I don't know if it was a direct influence. This is not a strictly Lutheran movement.
Okay.
We're talking about the Lutheran Pietists, and it was started by Spener, but there are other Pietism thoughts that are all over Europe. And yes, the Puritans do come from a pietistic leaning. And we're gonna at some point in here, I'm gonna say something that's gonna sound like I'm talking about the Pilgrims, and we'll get there when we get there. But yeah, so kind of but for what it's worth, the goal of Spener is not a bad one. You're going to see that Pietism has its problems. Joe probably knows, and I may have referenced it before, Pietism nowadays is a 4-letter word in the Lutheran Church. Piety is not. So we make a hard-line distinction. Some guy in a circuit, back where he was a pastor, made a very hard-line distinction between pietism and piety. But that would have been an unknown distinction at that time. In 1675, Spener published an agenda for the pietistic movement. He identified moral decay in German society and railed against Lutheran congregations for fostering that moral decay. You're starting to see why the Orthodox Party doesn't like these guys, right? They're getting yelled at by them, right? He preached against the individuals as not living as true Christians, right? Again, it kind of sounds like the Puritans. And he sought to cultivate a religion of the heart rather than a religion of the mind. Which again, Spener pietism, which is what it's sometimes called, is a good movement. He's doing a lot of good things, and quite frankly, Pastor Jordan and I will talk this way sometimes. The LCMS could do with a little bit of this Spener era pietism, right? And I think we're starting to move that way. We can be a little bit too in our books sometimes. Right? We got as Katie, as you and I were talking about, we got good stuff. No one will ever know if we don't tell them about it. Like we don't go live out in this world. Question or so Spener and his movement sought to shift concerns away from preservation of doctrine and toward purity of living, right? And here's my side note that unfortunately Bill Arndt is not here for. Spener was not the first Lutheran to do this or to call out not unchristian living and to have calls towards piety. The most notable individual to do this in the 17th century, the one that Spener was inspired by and drew directly from, is a man named Johann Arndt, who stressed the importance of true repentance and new obedience. And I was just going to ask Bill if there was any relation. I have no, it was 300 years ago, or more than that, 400 years ago, so who knows? Spener sought 4 concrete changes within the Lutheran Church. So these are the 4 goals of Spener-era pietism. And I'll read them out, and then I'll let you guys tell me what you think about these. More extensive use of the Bible beyond the lectionary readings, greater involvement of the laity in church ministries, emphasis on the cultivation of Christian love, and a shift in pastoral training away from theological disputations and towards theology as a practical discipline.
Sounds good.
I agree. Now, there's a part of me that wishes that all I did at seminary was read books, right? But we have the whole practical department. Which, I roll my eyes. It's a good, helpful department. It was just a little bit too touchy-feely before we went to seminary. But no, all of these are good things, right? I mean, yes, it's nice if your pastor knows everything, but if he can't talk to you about it or communicate it, it's useless, right? If all we're doing is writing dusty old books that are going to go off the printer dusty and never get any cleaner, then what's the point? But using the Bible outside of the lectionary, that's a good idea. I like that, right? We do that a lot in this class. Greater involvement of the laity in church ministries. Man, if Pastor Jordan and I, all we had to do was preach and administer the sacraments, and you guys did everything else around here, we would be in heaven. So we like that one a lot. Emphasis on the cultivation of Christian love. Have you ever heard one of my sermons? I don't use the cultivation word, but Christian love is in a lot of my sermons, right? It's the go and do part. And then we already talked about the shift in training. So these are good goals. Through Spener, the Pietists saw themselves as converting theology into practice. And they composed a poem to describe themselves, which my guess is it didn't translate well. This is a bit of a word salad, but here we go. He who on God's word in his study feeds, and then accordingly also a holy life leads. Right? So read the Bible in your study, and then go live a holy life. That's again. I'm not going to use that poem to describe everything, but again, my guess is it sounds better in German. No, I can't read German, and it was in English when I saw it. So, Spener, right? You may have noticed we have Spener era pietism. That means that there's a post-Spener pietism. So, Spener's influence was largely felt in the universities and city congregations with revival-style movements, and they inspired a lot of other folks to get these Bible studies, follow these 4-point plans, and all that kind of stuff. At the time, preachers and congregants reported conversion experiences as a fairly ecstatic movement. The emphasis on personal piety and reform of life, along with the ecstatic nature of the pietist movement, sparked backlash from the Orthodox Lutherans, right? There was probably some not great stuff going on with I don't know. If you're anything like me, anytime I hear revival, there's some warning flags that are going. Now, revival in its truest sense is a good, biblical, godly thing. Every one of your baptisms was a revival. However, some of these revival movements can get a little, as our first vice president would say, a little goofy and spooky. Like some weird stuff can be going on there. So just be careful with revivals. So it sparked backlash from Orthodox Lutherans, and here's the key, the expulsion of many of the pietists from the universities and congregations. So the movement started in the city. They spooked the Orthodox, who were the ones who had all the powers, and they kicked them out. And so what happens? Well, the movement goes rural. There were a few cities that really liked the pietists, where they had their own universities. There's a Hale University became a center of pietism. But for the most part, the movement, near the end of Spener's life and with the folks that he was teaching and inspiring, they all went out. Not necessarily because they wanted to, but because they got kicked out. You go do your goofy, spooky thing over there in the farm. I'm not there, so I don't care. Sort of idea is going on. So soon after the Orthodox backlash, the pietists moved their focus specifically to the poor. They founded and funded many orphanages, public schools, and the printing of very, very low-cost Bibles. So basically, they were caring for the poor, and they were getting God's word to the people. That was a big emphasis of the Pietist party, which is always, there's a Lutheran character of get people God's word, right? In 1713, the Prussian king, Friedrich Wilhelm I, we're going to meet another Friedrich Wilhelm next week, but the first, King Willie I, began associating himself with Pietist pastors. He liked these guys. He was very fond of them, even though he was a Calvinist. But I know, right? Basically, the Pietists won him over. And by 1729, all state pastors, because remember, the pastors and the churches are now under the auspices of the king post 30 Years' War. Right? All of the state pastors were required to have at least 2 years of training in the Pietist seminaries. He liked these guys a lot. The association with Wilhelm I begins the state-sponsored history of Pietism. Honestly, this is one of the places where things start to go bad. Not bad. They start to go a little off track. They're going to go bad elsewhere. Basically, what Wilhelm did is he liked these guys. He liked what they were doing for the poor, and so the Pietists became the social arm of his kingdom. So they were the welfare department, right? Anyone helping out if the poor were ever complaining to Wilhelm, he sent the Pietists to go deal with it. So they, in a lot of ways, they stopped becoming truly church-oriented and are now kind of an extension of the state. They're welfare. That's what they do. They're an extension of the king. we're going to depart ways from the pietist tracing of history, but this kind of causes, over the next couple of centuries, the pietists to become largely agnostic. The religion doesn't really matter. It's more about what you're doing for the people. You're working for the church or for the state. You got a state salary, right? Taxes, paying your bills, sort of thing. And you can still see that today in Europe, where a lot of pastors don't believe anything. They're just there to get their state paycheck and to be a social service. And this is where that starts. But we're not going to trace that history because the pietist movement kind of goes wrong enough in this century that the vein of Lutheranism that we are running with has departed from it. This is where that starts. Outside of Prussia, spiritualism joined itself to pietist movement. So spiritualism, very briefly, since we're running low on time, is basically like a mysticism, animistic, but that's probably not going to be a helpful word.
Yeah.
They're spiritual. I'm spiritual, but not religious crowd, right? Might do the tarot cards, crystal ball. What are they called? Stars, horoscopes. Wiccan's a little bit different. Yeah, astrology, right? That sort of crowd, and the pietists, they merged together. The spiritual pietists began rejecting historical Lutheranism. They dumped the confessions, right? The thing that kind of makes you a Lutheran, or one of the things that makes you a Lutheran, and they pushed towards a new revelatory version of Christianity. Basically, their goal was to remove everything historical from the church and get back to simply Jesus. Now, there are no groups like that around today. You've never heard of any Christians who want to just go back to the Acts Church or anything like that, I'm sure. There's some sarcasm there. But these movements, not the spiritual, more the pietism, the other branches of pietism, paired themselves with the Enlightenment era historical criticism, right? So basically, when pietism and rationalism run into each other, they merge into one thing, which is, as we said, with the agnostic charge of rationalism and Enlightenment era thinking, this is going to become a bad thing, right? And so the movements paired with the Enlightenment era historical criticism, which sought to inject human reason over the interpretation of the Bible, right? So who's the arbiter of truth in the scriptures? It's you and your reason. You get to decide what is irrational in the Bible, and you get to decide what is rational and belongs there.
Okay.
All right, questions. We've now covered all of our groups. So questions about any of that before we start smashing the groups into each other and see what comes out the other side? Honestly, we've already talked about a lot of these sorts of conflicts that are coming. The first group we're going to kind of deal with in more detail is the Orthodox and the Pietists. So what happens when those two groups come together? Well, I'm sure this will come as a surprise to you, but those dusty old Orthodox folks, when mysticism paired itself into Pietism and spiritualism, they were not fans. And just as much when atheistic or agnostic rationalism joined itself to the Pietism. So basically, the two arms of Pietism that have kind of branched off of themselves, one that is mystical spiritual and one that is rational agnostic, both of them get into big fights with the Lutheran Orthodox. They cannot mesh together, right? They've fundamentally changed what they are believing. Initially, there was a lot of respect for Spener Pietism. There still is now. And that he had identified problems in the daily lives of believers, and here's a great one, and had introduced practical ways to actually address the problem. Because it's one thing to notice a problem, it's another to have even an idea on how to fix it, right? I think we're really good. Yeah, I've been in so many church meetings, and I'm not picking on River Cliff or churches in general, I'm sure all meetings go this way, right? It's easy for council to figure out what the problem is.
Oh, yeah.
And how easy is it for us to find a solution to that problem? Well, normally, we don't even talk about potential solutions because we just say, oh, yeah, that's a real problem. We should fix that. Moving on. Which is not only just church counseling. It's most meetings I've ever been in that are dealing with an issue deal with it that way. This is a problem. I agree. We should do something. Yes, we should. What's the next thing we're going to talk about? Well, practical steps, even if they don't work, just something. However, Pietism, which included either mysticism or rationalism, was just condemned wholesale. This is where Pietism goes bad, or why it's a four-letter word nowadays. Yet even Pietism, without outside influence, had its opponents within the Orthodox Party. So just the fact of Pietism, even if you remove spiritualism, mysticism, rationalism, there are still people that in the Orthodox Party that disagreed with them. Problems identified here with the Pietists include neglect of communal worship. Basically, you don't need to go to church. Stay in your little small groups, or well, it's starting to get spiritual to say, God's everywhere, so you can worship anywhere. But kind of the house church sort of thing. You meet with your little group, and then you're good. Do your Bible study. You don't need to go to church on Sunday. A big problem that we didn't talk about here is the Pietists had a habit of dismissing clergy that were not perfect in holiness, which we talked about the Docetist heresy back in my heretics class. That's popping back up again. So if pastor has any sort of moral failing or is not perfectly pure in his holiness, get rid of him. He's out. That's problematic. I would not like that personally because I'm not perfect. They had an emphasis on regeneration, and they had a problem with mixing faith and works. So we had some faith work, mixing faith and works. So basically, you need works to be saved in a very problematic way. And then there was also an emphasis on asceticism, condemnation rather of Christian freedom. So the Pietists did not let you dance. You could not play cards. These sorts of things. That's the Puritan reference. And if there's a certain person watching the recording, I'm talking about you. I know of at least one person here who this had not gone away completely for them in their life. So I'm not going to tell you who.
Don't out him.
I'm not certain if this is.
I'm law. I don't even know what you're talking about.
I know this person's not watching right now, so it'll be on the recording. But anyway, if you are watching, you know it's for you, and you can mention it to me next time you see it this evening. And if you don't, I'll know you're not watching my Bible class. They also had a problem with preaching of the attainability of perfection. So the Pietists said you can be perfect and you need to be perfect.
Great.
Were you guys around for my class on John's epistles? That's very clearly
themselves constantly.
basic. Well, yes. I mean, the Puritans came up for a reason.
Sounds utterly miserable.
Yeah, John would say, don't you get it?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So
Can't dance. You're not. You have to be perfect. I would have ulcers. I mean,
yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, you can see why we have problems with the Pietists, right? Piety, good. Pietism, even without the bad infusions, there's some stuff we don't like there. All right, what about the Orthodox? By the way, the Orthodox is if you haven't figured, the Orthodox is the train that we come from, or the stream that we flow out of, which shouldn't be a surprise since everything I've said about them sounds like I'm talking about the LCMS. I'm not talking about the LCMS, but I may as well be, because we are a product of our history. So rationalism, with its stress on the reasonableness of God, began to cause theological problems like the second that people started thinking this way. So early 18th century. Professors in Germany, which Germany becomes a hub, especially in the universities, becomes a hub and a breeding ground, if you will, of rationalism. this will come back in the 20th century. I'm doing a lot of prep work for the split in the 60s. So professors in Germany would begin to remove God from the conversation and necessity, even in the aspect of religion. So we don't have to talk about God when we're having our theology classes, which, considering theology means words about God. I'm not quite sure how that
So
works.
smartly done.
I know, right? Leibniz is a name you might recognize. He was a philosopher and a professor, would argue that God certainly could exist and was capable of revelation to humanity, but that revelation must not contradict with human reason. So now all of a sudden it says, well, basically the nicer way of putting this is God will not reveal himself in an unreasonable way. God will not do anything that contradicts human reason because God made human reason. Now, Leibniz also says, God may or may not exist. Who cares?
Do they live in the world?
We don't live in the modern world, right? We live in the postmodern world. And the way by the way, I say that. There are lots of people out there who still think this way. We were talking about one of them earlier, Katie, you and I.
Calvin?
Oh, no, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Other conversations. The major religious movement to come out of rationalism is deism. And so basically, deism is the belief that God is everywhere and in everything. God is also everyone. And God is, but yet God is not a separate thing. God is just nature. God is existence. God is the world around us. Everything is God. Everyone is God, right? God and nature become one and the same.
Is that Wiccan?
No, this is deism. This is what almost all the founding fathers were. They were all deists.
The who?
The founding fathers,
Oh,
like George
yeah,
Washington
okay.
and Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, those guys. For what it's worth, most people will not say that they're deists. I think there are more people who think like deists out there than you might imagine. One of the places that deism and the way deism thinks pops up in the way we talk all the time is when we talk about Mother Nature. Nature finds a way.
Or say
Nature has a way.
instead of God.
Right, or like the universe is telling me something, right? That's kind of mystical deism, but right when you watch any nature documentary where Benedict Cumberbatch can't pronounce penguin, it's a very funny clip if you don't know what I'm talking about. You will inevitably hear the line, right? But nature knows what it's doing, right? This personification of nature is an outcropping of deism. That's where it comes from. By the end of the century, rationalism had co-opted the goals of Pietism and saw religion as the way to overcome the gaps that reason alone could not fill, particularly in the motivations to moral living. So basically, where the philosophers hadn't figured out Kant yet, because Kant doesn't exist, where Kant said, well, this is how we can make reason fill the gap for morality and ethics. Where those gaps existed before Kant, the philosophers would just say, we'll just shove God into that little crack, and that just solves it. He's the spackle in the plan. Where we haven't quite figured out how human reason can be the arbiter of everything, we'll just smear on a little bit of God here and there. Once we figure it out, we'll scrape it off and get rid of it, right? Which is what Nietzsche recognizes. Nietzsche recognizes that with Kant, we've scraped up all of the God. There is no more God in our thinking. Therefore, God is dead and we've killed him. That's quite a metaphor. I like that. God's the spackle that we're scraping. That's not in here, but that was pretty good. The Orthodox response to rationalism was an emphasis on true biblical and confessional doctrine, as well as an emphasis on participation in the parish and worship life of the church. So basically, read your Bible, read your confessions, go to church. That's the solution to rationalism. All right, we do have one more section that has nothing to do with anything we've been talking about, but it is very brief, and that is Lutheran world missions. So in the 18th century in particular, you have, and this is going to sound strange, a revival of the Great Commission. It was mostly understood by Lutherans up to the 18th century that the Great Commission was done. That God had made it to the ends of the earth, and that we were kind of done with that whole missionary thing. Not all Lutherans felt this way, but a lot of them did. In the 18th century, particularly with Pietism, and again, people spreading out, the Lutherans kind of figured, no, God isn't everywhere. Right? The Great Commission does still apply to us. You will still, every once in a while, you'll find an LCMS Lutheran even that is utterly convinced that the Great Commission doesn't apply anymore, that it's done, we're finished with it. I'm not like that. If you've ever listened to any of Pastor Jordan's sermons, you know that he does not think that either, right? We got some horses that we like to beat, and that's one of his. Yeah, we'll see that there. So Lutheran missions began in many ways as a response to religious persecutions. So when we're persecuted, we leave. And what do we take with us? Our religion. As the various states and princes attempted to force religious change on their subjects' confessional, on their subjects, should have put a comma there, confessional Lutheran groups would emigrate to places like North America, for example. We talked a lot about those earlier. While in North America, in the very early United States, Lutherans would embark on mission work directed at the non-Lutheran and non-Christian people that lived around them. Perhaps the greatest area of Lutheran mission, and this is a little bit of a self-serving comment, Lutheran mission work in the late 18th and early 19th centuries was missions to the Native Americans living west of the Mississippi, mostly because that's what the LCMS was doing. That was the first LCMS mission field was the Native Americans. And a lot of good came out of that. Missions were also driven by an increased emphasis on personal piety. Pietism had a lot to do with this, right? You are a Christian, go live it out, and part of that is showing it to other people, right? And a revival of the Great Commission, like I mentioned, with missionaries actually being trained and sent out. Missionaries going to Africa, India, China, and Japan. Those are like locations that this actually happened with. Lutheran missions in whatever century we're in, the 17th or 18th, started or established a 5-point model for mission work, modeled after one of the missions in India, which was a very successful one. I want to list them, and we're going to kind of do that reaction thing again and see which of these sound familiar. What do we think of them? That sort of thing. So here's the 5-point model for mission work. Christian education, particularly in parochial schools. Free access to the Word of God in the local language. Lutherans giving people the Word of God in a way they can understand. Like, that's just our DNA. Communicate the gospel in a way which was culturally relevant to the people. Focus on personal conversion, not specific ethnic or socioeconomic groups. So that's basically, don't only go after the prince, right? Go after everyone. And organize a church as soon as possible and install locally trained people as servants. So what do we think? I mean, it sounds basically like how we do missions, with one exception. There's one in there that might have perked your ears up, and that was the third one. Communicate the gospel in a way which was culturally relevant to the people. That's controversial today. It was controversial for the mission in India. Basically what that means is, if you need to call God Brahman, or Brahma, or Dharma, just do it, because the people will understand what you're talking about, and then you can kind of fix it once they get into the schools. It's not a great way. It's not a great way to do it.
Nope.
I can understand where the thought is, right? Communicate to the people on their terms. So, okay, that's not bad. But there are certain things. The Bible into their language, but you don't change it. You don't culturally appropriate the gospel. Because the gospel doesn't need to be appropriated to culture, right? The gospel is just the gospel, let it stand for it. So, 5 of these points or 4 of these 5 points are basically how we do missions, and one of them is a little squishy. questions on anything that we've covered today? Perfect. I've gone a little over, but I also started a little bit late, so I'm going to call it a wash. So let's close then, as we often do with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. All right, thank you, everyone, and I will see you all next week for the LCMS.